Welcome to an ASRM webinar on donor anonymity. I am Sarah Amaya, curriculum designer at ASRM. Joining us are panelists Emily Mounts, Melanie Mickelson, and Sigal Klipstein, our moderator, Susan Crocken, and my colleague, Jessica Goldstein. Before we begin, please note, the views expressed here do not necessarily reflect the views of ASRM. All attendees will be muted except the presenters. Time at the end of the presentation will be reserved for questions. Please type a question in the question chat window at any time. We will read as many selected questions as possible to the presenters during the allotted question and answer time. A recording of this webinar will be archived on the ASRM website in the coming weeks. Please watch your email for notification. Let me introduce our moderator. Ms. Crocken has been practicing assisted reproductive technology law since 1988, having started one of the first U.S. legal practices devoted exclusively to ART and adoption law. In addition to her private practice, Susan has authored multiple articles and chapters. ASRM's Legally Speaking column, which she created in 1990, co-authored the book Legal Conceptions with the late Dr. Howard Jones Jr. in 2010, and currently teaches ART law at Georgetown Law Center. I will now turn the presentation over to Ms. Crocken to introduce today's speakers.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting and very timely webinar. As tonight's moderator, I was tasked with bringing a very brief historical and legal perspective to this topic. And so I'm going to give you just a very, very quick overview to set the stage for this evening's presentations. I am delighted to see how far this issue has come over the past several decades and now into the mainstream and a topic for this evening. As some of you know, donor conception has come a long way in the U.S., starting in 1884 when the first donor insemination was done in Philadelphia, where the wife was chloroformed, the husband told after the fact, and the donor was the handsomest medical student the doctor could identify. Skip forward to the 1950s, and donor insemination in the U.S. was a common treatment to address male infertility, for heterosexual married couples, that is, but it was often cloaked in secrecy. Mixing donor and infertile husband sperm was standard of care for many years, and the laws surrounding donor insemination exclusively focused on ensuring that the husband was the legally recognized father of any donor-conceived child. In the U.S., 46 states have enacted laws along those lines. In 1999, an IVF World Congress plenary presentation questioned the legitimacy of donor anonymity. In 2008, the first national seminar in the U.S. was convened by Dr. Andrea Braverman and law professor Nanette Elser, proposing the formation of a national gamete donor registry in recognition of the inevitable disintegration of the anonymity model. In 2017, the Uniform Parentage Act was updated. This is a model act on which most states base their family laws, and they included for the first time Section 9, which requires gamete banks and fertility clinics to ask donors if they want their identifying information disclosed when a child turns 18. To date, only a few states have adopted that law or anything similar, and very few laws address privacy issues or interest by donor-conceived offspring in knowing their origins. It should be noted that the UK and many other European countries have taken the opposite approach, banning anonymous donation, and there are a number of international bodies that recognize a child's right to know their identity. In the U.S. today, with family building now expanded to same-sex couples and single mothers by choice, with the widespread access that we're going to discuss tonight to genetic testing, donor direct and other registries, accelerating all of these disclosure issues, and the rapidly changing perspectives on what offspring both want and are entitled to know about their origins, the reality is that donor anonymity as we once understood it is long gone. So I'm delighted to see these developments have all propelled this issue now into the mainstream in our tonight's topic. Tonight's presenters are representing medical, ethical, genetic testing, and counseling perspectives, and they will discuss the interprofessional aspects of this evolution and the challenges of balancing past promises with the evolving technologies and the current, and I would suggest future realities. Our first speaker is Emily Mount. She is a board-certified genetic counselor at ORM Fertility, where she is heavily involved in the genetic screening of gamete donors and intended parents. She's been a clinical genetic counselor in prenatal and reproductive genetics for over 20 years and is the immediate past chair of the ASRM Genetic Counseling Professional Group. Emily, we look forward to hearing your presentation.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Susan, and thank you to ASRM for inviting me to participate today. I have no disclosures to report. So commercial DNA testing is clearly now connecting people all over the world, and the end of donor anonymity has been driven, of course, by the availability of direct-to-consumer testing. And this is really an entire world of products that are available to consumers now. Today's discussion is focused on what is referred to in the center here as relationship testing. My role today is to talk a little bit about how this testing is done, the types of relationships it can identify, and the discoveries, whether incidental or intentional, that can be experienced in the context of gamete donation. I think it's important to point out that relationship testing can be pursued as a primary or a standalone direct-to-consumer test, but it can also be ordered as an adjunct, or in many cases, even just an afterthought to other types of direct-to-consumer tests listed here. Ancestry testing, tests that provide health information, traits or the quote-unquote fun tests, and raw data file access, which consumers may use to glean additional information beyond that which the testing company has initially issued. So some individuals go after this relationship data with purpose, and others stumble upon it somewhat unknowingly. The first company to establish commercial DNA testing for ancestry purposes was Family Tree DNA, which was founded in 2000 by Bennett Greenspan, who is a Jewish-American entrepreneur with a love of family history and genealogy. Today, 3 other primary companies have joined Family Tree DNA in controlling the majority of the direct-to-consumer market, including Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage, which is an Israeli company. Today, although exact estimates are difficult, probably more than 30 million people have taken a consumer DNA test. In 2018, an article published in Science concluded that only about 2% of the US population needs to have undergone genealogy testing in order for everyone else in the country to be identified. And what I mean by identified is that you would simply be showing up as someone who exists in a genealogy database, and then if enough sleuthing online was done by someone who was interested using publicly available information, your identity could likely be discovered. The analysis focused on Americans of Northern European background because 75% of the users on the sites analyzed for the study were of that demographic, but the data could really be extrapolated to any other group. So if we only have to test 2% for this to occur, and based on the numbers I showed you in the previous slide, we've tested perhaps 9% of the population already, you can see how, even though this study had some major limitations, it's likely that we're already beyond the point where any of us could really hope to be anonymous in terms of our DNA connectedness. So how does relationship testing work? Well, it starts out very innocuous, and let's not forget, for many people, it will stay that way. A kit is ordered online, a saliva sample or buccal swab is collected at home and mailed back to the lab. The consumer chooses what information they would like to receive. And the sample will contain epithelial and/or white blood cells, and the genetic code in these cells should be identical to the rest of the body. There are very rare exceptions to this, such as if someone has had a bone marrow transplant, but for the most part, these will match. The DNA is extracted, and the testing that is most commonly performed today is referred to as autosomal relationship testing. It was named this in order to contrast it with older methods that involved Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA. Now, the exact technologies and algorithms that are used to carry out relationship testing are a little bit different for each company, and these details can be found on the company website, frequently in white papers. And with all due respect, I'll just say if you're having any trouble sleeping these days, you might go through one of these white papers at night. It might help get you to sleep. But nearly all major labs are now using genotyping arrays. Genotyping, as you may know, is determining the DNA letter that is present at a particular location. And SNPs, or single nucleotide polymorphisms, are spots of DNA that are specifically chosen to examine because people will frequently have normal variation of the letters in that spot. So you can sort of string these SNPs together, as you see in the haplotypes to the right of this image, and you can find sort of a unique DNA fingerprint for that person, some percentage of which will be shared by their relatives. Most companies will end up probing around 500 to 700,000 SNPs within an individual's DNA in order to get at that estimate of genetic relatedness between the other individuals who are in that particular company's database. Another term frequently used in the industry that illustrates the same concept is identity by descent. DNA is mixed up or recombined as it's passed down through eggs and sperm in order to maintain genetic diversity in the population. And a shared segment of DNA between two related individuals is referred to as identical by descent. Obviously, the more of these shared segments of DNA that two different individuals have, such as with this orange segment that's shared by the bottom set of individuals, then the more likely it is that they have a shared common ancestor. So ultimately, this testing will generate a list of DNA matches to the test taker, along with a prediction of how closely related they are. And I'm sure many, many of you have received these results yourselves. How exactly companies determine relationships, again, is very individualized, but generally is based on two factors, centimorgans and segments. Centimorgans are a measurement of genetic distance along a chromosome, and this denotes how large the matching DNA segments are between individuals. Segments are just simply the total number of different shared pieces of DNA. So this match list may include full names, sometimes it's just initials, and whether direct contact can be made with a match depends on the particular opt-in or opt-out settings that each individual here chose. And of course, with time, this list of matches can also change as more people are tested or even as people may choose to retract their information. And this chart reminds us what can be expected as far as the percentage of DNA that relatives of different degrees share. And this is represented in the upper right-hand corner of each of these rectangles. So as I'm sure you know, we share half of our DNA with our close first-degree relatives, like our mother or the egg provider, and our father or the sperm provider. And then we share about 25% with second-degree relatives, like aunts, uncles, grandparents, or half-siblings, and so forth. Then when we look at the centimorgans, which again is one of the indicators of closeness, there's an average number for each relationship. But there's also a fairly large range of normal, and there's overlap of that range between different individuals who have different degrees of relatedness. So, for example, a half-sibling with whom you happen to share a lower than average centimorgan count could look the same on this testing as a first cousin with whom you happen to share a higher than average centimorgan count. Some companies will also make guesses about a relationship based on the ages of the individuals. But the more distant the relationship is, the less certain it's going to be exactly how that person is related to you. Given this variability, the company algorithms can sometimes, as this article discusses, jump to conclusions. Because of this, 23andMe, for example, has now decided to list matches as predicted relationships and actually allows the user to edit or to trump the computer-generated hypothesis of the relationship. Now, having highlighted some of the limitations to the testing, the main point I actually want to make here is that relationship testing is overall actually quite accurate. And the vast majority of the time when someone receives a match, it is correct in its assessment. It's, of course, very normal for someone receiving a surprising result to go down a path of questioning. You know, was there a sample mix-up? Was there a data error? Am I a chimera? Or other very, very rare potential explanations for a result that does not fit into their known narrative. But usually the test is correct. So what are some of the possible scenarios that this testing can uncover that can have an impact on donors, donor-conceived children, and their families? Well, we've all heard this first one. An individual simultaneously learns that they were conceived via sperm donor and that they have 30 half-siblings. This becomes sort of the usual case that we see, and I don't know about you, but I've almost stopped clicking on these articles because it seems like they're just so common now. The second one, the mother of an egg donor who was unaware of her daughter's donation is contacted by one of her daughter's genetic offspring for an explanation of their second-degree relationship. So remember, even if that donor herself is not in a database, her mother and her donor's genetic offspring will still, of course, come up as matches. The third one, this is one that another genetic counselor shared with me that I found interesting. A teenager who knew that she was donor-conceived was diagnosed with a potential genetic disease. In this case, it was a multifactorial condition, Crohn's disease. And she attempted to find her sperm donor because she knew that he had had this condition himself. She knew this from his profile. And she felt like she simply wanted to talk to someone else who had experienced this, and who better to talk to than the sperm donor. So, you know, we would hope that in these types of situations, people would first go to the donor sibling registry or to the agency, clinic, or bank where, you know, that enabled the conception. But we know that people are sometimes going directly to these labs in order to make these connections directly. Number 4, a previous egg donor learns that beyond the offspring from the 4 IVF cycles she agreed to, there are at least 5 others via embryo donation. So needless to say, with embryo donation, this becomes a possibility as well. And this may absolutely be something that she consented to. Many egg donor programs do consent donors to understand that their embryos may be donated beyond those initial cycles, but it can still be a surprise to them to learn that it actually occurred. And finally, father of a sick child submits his child's DNA to a direct-to-consumer lab in hopes of making contact with the egg donor, as her DNA sample could actually be key to helping interpret the clinical significance of a genetic change found in his child. So these are just a few examples in an endless list of possible scenarios, some of which entail deliberately seeking connections, some even in a time of medical need, and others uncovering incidental connections. And as we'll hear more today, of course, people will process these in different ways. I also want to highlight one case that is especially interesting from a genetic counseling standpoint. This was a case of an egg donor who was diagnosed after her donation with autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease. This is a condition that, of course, would have a 50% risk of recurrence to her genetic offspring. She very appropriately notified the egg bank that she had used of her new diagnosis and was told at that time that, in fact, her eggs had never been used. She herself then 2 years later underwent direct-to-consumer testing and, lo and behold, matched to 2 genetic offspring, neither of whom were aware that they were donor conceived. So I find this one especially difficult because neither the donor nor the offspring knew that a connection existed, and because everyone has a right to an accurate family medical history. We know that family history is a very powerful tool in enabling preventative medicine, but only if it's accurate. And this is one of the reasons that genetics professionals are largely, I believe, in support of disclosure of donor conception. The last thing I want to say is that direct-to-consumer testing is not the only type of genetic testing that can uncover these relationships. Really, almost any type of genetic testing that is comparing DNA between presumed family members can uncover mismatches, so to speak. And because all of these types of genetic tests are increasingly used now in clinical settings, there are just simply more scenarios we have today in which DNA surprises can occur, or in which there can be a need for donor involvement to help interpret clinical genetic test results for a patient and a family. With that, I will thank you, and we'll hand it back to Susan to the other panelists.
Thanks so much, Emily. That was fascinating. Our next speaker is Melanie Mickelson. Melanie has over 20 years working in the field of fertility counseling with a special interest in third-party reproduction and embryo donation. She works as a mental health counselor and donor liaison with Seattle Reproductive Medicine. Melanie is past chair of the ASRM Mental Health Mentoring Committee and is the creator of Hold Hope LLC, a fertility counseling and advocacy practice. Melanie?
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you, Emily, for that wonderful presentation. And thanks to ASRM for allowing us to present on this very important topic. I have nothing to disclose. DNA testing is a silent witness to the truth. That's one of the things that I use in my mind to guide me through how I counsel intended parents as well as donors, as well as donor-conceived offspring. DNA testing has become a disruptor in many settings, but has larger meaning in third-party reproductive counseling and services. There are 3 stories in my mind that are being told. One, it's the story of the parents' process of conception using a donor to become a family. 2, there's the child's story about conception and their own genetic heritage. And 3, there's a story of a donor and how his or her decision making will affect them and be a part of their lives moving forward. As mentioned earlier, ASRM Ethics Committee report of 2018 provides some more updated information on how clinics and programs and egg banks and sperm banks can have guidance in this rapidly changing arena. Another note was the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. This was in November of 2019. And as you can see, much of the focus was on the right of the donor-conceived people, their access to information, ensuring there's complete records, and focusing really on the best interest of the child. This is what we see in other countries. In 1984, Sweden being the first country to make donors non-anonymous. And as you can tell, different countries are further along in the process than the United States of making policy and statements on the importance of informing donor-conceived offspring. who are the stakeholders that we serve as mental health professionals, but really as anyone who works in this field. It's a lot of stakeholders that we serve: intended parents, the offspring, donors, and possibly their extended family, as we've seen in examples where sometimes we might actually be contacted by a relative of the donor who has wanted some information. Sperm banks, egg banks and agencies, embryo donors and programs, fertility clinics, and actually attorneys as well, when we help walk people through the process of what they might want to put in their legal contracts. Our involvement usually begins in a person seeking medical treatment to use third-party reproduction. And we shift from whether they want to use donor gametes to how are they going to use donor gametes. That is a very important beginning, but my belief is that we as mental health professionals should be used as a support system and source for now and ongoing in the future. Our role becomes more non-medical decision-making at that point, but helping provide ongoing assistance for advice seeking, process of disclosure, helping with family connections, helping with donor requests, counseling of donors, and education. What I am going to talk about is my experience working embedded in a fertility clinic. I do some outside consulting work as well with donor screenings, but my primary focus is going to be, what does it look like as a role for a counselor that is working within a fertility clinic? Counseling of donors, let's start there. So, in our clinic, what we do is we provide a lot of education to front load what donors know about the process. I'm primarily going to speak on egg donation. We provide written informed consent. We provide donor information sessions. We provide information asking, do they understand what levels of identity are even offered? Our donor consent are explained, witnessed, and we witness their signing. In Washington State, as was mentioned earlier, we actually have a law that does talk about identity disclosure or release, and so therefore we will use an ID declaration and have a donor consign whether, yes, she agrees to release of her identifying information once a child turns 18 or above, the donor conceived offspring, or no, she does not agree to that. There is no pressure for her to sign one way or the other. We talk with donors about DNA direct-to-consumer testing, explanation of how even if they don't sign up or use it, they could still be found. We inform donors they have rights. We talk about the discussion of psychological benefits and the risk of disclosure and outcome. We also talk about adult versus childhood photos. Most programs show at least childhood photos, and some have moved to showing adult photos as well. For the large national egg bank, my egg bank, that we partner with, 40 to 50% of people that are asked to show adult photos of our donors actually agree to show adult photos. We need to talk too about, what does contact really mean? When we talk about future contact, we talk about initially it would be the release of their information. Then beyond that, that contact becomes something that would be decided between the donor and the adult offspring if they were to connect. That could be letters, that could be pictures, it could be the equivalent of Facebook friends, social media. Donors have a right to decide what level of contact that they want besides the basic disclosure of their name and date of birth. We also keep records of adverse events, and we offer counseling sessions at any point for donors or any intended parents that are seeking or needing further counseling once their donation has ended. It's not uncommon, as we know, that donors may feel very differently today versus 10 years from now versus 20 years from now. Donors are curious and they wonder about the offspring. Sometimes they don't have much curiosity initially. That curiosity can grow. So I think it's very important to understand that donors have curiosity as well. the disclosure, and what is the impact on their decision making. Honestly, most donors compare programs online before they even come in to see us. They usually have made a decision already on how they feel about disclosure or non-disclosure. Currently, about 60% of the egg donors that we screen say yes to open identity release of their identifying information. There definitely can be regional differences. What I have noted working with other clinics and programs is the West Coast, where I'm located, tends to have more donors that are open to that possibility for disclosure, whereas the East Coast donors, as a stereotype and whole, and the Southern East Coast donors don't tend to be as comfortable or readily signing those identity release documents. However, the younger adult population, as we know, can have a different threshold for privacy. Anecdotally, there may be yearly updates that the donors will come in if they continue to donate, and they will re-sign consent. So what we do is, if the donation continues, we will have them sign a yearly consent to that. I anecdotally have not seen donors change their mind from yes to no or from no to yes. An example of some sample language that we might speak with donors about, or even put in our chart notes. We definitely do talk with the genetics counseling as well as the mental health counseling, and we talk about, in light of the recent advantages of genetic technology and commercial availability, that we can't guarantee donor anonymity anymore. We talk about protecting their privacy. We talk about relatives or offspring pursuing commercial testing. And we also finally reinforce the possibility of this outcome may be greater as more enhanced testing becomes available in genetics for the years to come. Counseling intended parents. When we counsel intended parents, I'm going to go through this because a lot of this is similarities regarding education that we would talk with donors about on direct-to-consumer DNA testing. We talk about anonymity versus privacy, education on developmental stages, resources to age appropriately, talk with their children about donor conception. We talk a lot about the discussion of grief, genetic loss. People need to be able to have a forum to express that, to be able to move on and have renewed hope for a new type of treatment using donor gametes. Again, our role is of ongoing help and services provided. We also want to be sensitive to the cultural considerations of using donor gametes. There are definitely differences in different religions and different cultures that might not be the same as a bias that I could have towards open donation or openness in information sharing. So we definitely want to be very cognizant and aware of that. What types of questions do recipients usually have regarding anonymity and disclosure? Donor eggs are now used in 12% of all IVF cycles, making it among the fastest growing fertility treatments, one of them. Recipients differ in what they want to know. So when I work with intended parents, I say recipients and or intended parents, some want to know a lot of information up front at the time of the match or at the time that they're picking a donor. Others want to know more information after the child is born. It becomes more real to them when there is a real live human being. Desires are going to change over time. That is a given. Curiosity is going to grow, and curiosity grows with the intended parents as well as obviously with the child. Often there's fear and anxiety that's based in the beginning of these processes. It usually revolves around unrealistic fears of things such as, does the donor want to track me down? And does the donor want to find me and take my child away? There was a study, 2015 Fertility Sterility, Julia Woodward, and she looked at post-treatment information seeking for intended parents. What they were seeking was curiosity about the physical appearances and similarities with the donor. These were the major ones. Intended parents want information to help give their child a sense of identity, maybe information that they didn't have initially from the profile. They're seeking updated medical information, and they are also seeking connection with other donor-conceived siblings, especially in families where there is an only child. Common fears of parents who use donors definitely need to be addressed. They have fears that the children might reject them, fears they will consider the donor a parent. The parent's comfort level depends on addressing these fears, and that is once again where we can really play an ongoing role. There are differences in gamete donations, as I will show in the next slides. Banks, clinics, agencies, those are all places that you might get a donor egg, a donor sperm, donor embryos. Lots of varying terminology. There's regional differences, and the terminology can especially be confusing for any intended parent who's trying to sift through what does this terminology mean and pick a donor. It can even be confusing to professionals that do this every day. In a recent internet search of 4 large U.S. sperm banks, this gives an example of the types and numbers of people, but as well as the varying terminology. So OpenID, non-ID, anonymous, OpenID disclosure. Bank 1, there were 164 sperm donors listed as OpenID, and only 2 of those are anonymous. This particular bank prides itself and markets itself on having majority of donors be what they call OpenID. Bank number 2, they use the terms non-ID and ID donors. They had 254 non-ID donors listed on their website and 210 ID donors. Bank number 3, 230 using the term anonymous, 161 using ID disclosure, 76 using OpenID. Bank number 4, 17 anonymous, 21 ID disclosure, 30 OpenID. So as you can see, that is a very wide array of words or terminology, and it's confusing to figure out what does each one of those mean. Some sperm banks actually will charge more per vial to be an ID disclosure or open donor. Egg banks, usually you're going to see words like anonymous, identity restricted, or options to have identity disclosed, open release, or open. You don't see as much on websites listed for egg banks or egg agencies. Typically, there's going to be more mental health screening and education done on egg donors versus sperm donors. Hence, my belief is that egg donors tend to get more counseling about identity disclosure, terminology, and what that means. Who seeks contact and how can we help them? So people that I deal with that are seeking contact are intended parents, donor-conceived adult and children, donor sibling groups, family members of donors, and donors themselves. I haven't yet had children of donors reaching out to me, but I am sure that will probably happen sometime in the future. There was a 2018 survey conducted by We Are Donor Conceived. They looked at 127 donor-conceived people. 91% of those have taken a DNA test. What was their reasoning for taking a DNA test? 93% wanted to find donor siblings. 79% wanted ancestry information, and 56% wanted health information. What is it they want to know? They want to know curiosity. I just have wondered for a long time. They want to know about physical characteristics, updated life information. What did the donor become? Who is the donor? They want to see a picture. A picture is worth 1,000 words. They want to help develop a sense of self and their own identity. How do they relate to the donor? Do they have genetics, have siblings? And what information are they going to pass on to their own offspring? And one of the things that I think is amazing that you'll hear is they actually want to be able just to thank the donor. And that is something I think sometimes we forget and is missed, that Maybe once they find out initial information, they just want to thank the donor. Conclusions. As we know, this has forever altered all of our realities. I have worked in this field for over 20 years. It's changed dramatically the way that I practice and the way I counsel and educate all parties. One of the things that I think is really important to keep in mind is what can we do if a donor contacts us to say, I've been contacted directly. I have had these cases numerous times, and I've come up with a formula that I think might be helpful. One thing is to tell the donors, go slow. Don't feel pressure to immediately respond. Keep your boundaries in mind. Maybe even change your social media settings until you decide what you want to release. Responses could be no response, a polite response, or really deciding how do they feel about contact. It's helpful to encourage any donor that's contacted independently to contact their own program or bank where they might have donated if it's still in existence. Sometimes it's not. Or contact the fertility clinic if you know where you donated for guidance. Develop a template of information or health history that you might want to share, because oftentimes it's the initial tip of the iceberg when they're contacted by one person, and they're not expecting that they could be contacted by multiple people, and that becomes emotionally overwhelming, and it takes a lot of their energy to deal with that. And so having just a basic health information history template of things they'd like to share. Consider informing your family members that you have donated if you haven't already. Seek help of a mental health professional, someone who has knowledge of these issues. Don't respond to a minor child. If it's a minor child reaching out, direct them back to the bank or their clinic. Encourage them to speak with their parent. The bottom line is we do need more support for donors and intended parents and offspring. We need more guidelines for banks and for clinics and for agencies. I will welcome questions at the end, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Melanie. That was very, very interesting and informative. Our last speaker is Dr. Sigal Klipstein. She practices reproductive endocrinology and infertility at Invia, fertility specialist in Chicago, and she's also an assistant professor at the University of Chicago. Dr. Klipstein is the chair-elect of the American Society for Reproductive Medicine Ethics Committee. Sigal?
Thank you, Susan, and thank you to ASRM for inviting me to speak, and of course to my wonderful co-panelists, Emily and Melanie. I wanted to shift gears a little bit and talk about the ethics of donor anonymity. My only disclosure is that I sit as a member of the Physicians' Council of Resolve. And so I wanted to close this part of the talk with three main questions regarding the concept of donor anonymity. The first one is, does donor anonymity exist? And I think the answer to that is already pretty clear from Emily and Melanie's talk. Then the second corollary question is, should anonymity exist? And the third is to look at this triad of the parties or the players in the triangle of third-party reproduction. And so the question is, who actually has a right to anonymity? Is it the donor who might have donated thinking it would be anonymous? Is it the intended parents? And we have to keep in mind that when these arrangements are made, there's only a donor and an intended parent, and those are the only two stakeholders. But as soon as a child is born, that third part of the triangle is very much a stakeholder in the conversation, and that the rights to anonymity or lack thereof, which that child was never asked about, come to the forefront. And so, does donor anonymity exist? The first question. This is an article that came out just last year in Stat News. There's no such thing as anonymity with consumer DNA tests. Sperm banks reconsider long-held promises to donors. And I want to go back to this question of the promise. Who is the promise to, and who should keep the promise? And are these promises just promises, fair promises? And as Emily discussed, the direct-to-consumer DNA testing market has exploded, and this has made it such that anonymity as a concept is very different from what it was in many cases for the donors and the intended parents when they entered into this agreement. Today, maybe 30 million people have already willingly sent their DNA samples to one of these commercial companies. It's estimated that in the next couple of years, By 2021, over 100 million people in the world will have sent these samples. And so you can imagine that the ease of finding that your donor conceived and who provided your gamete is going to become just that much easier over time. And so if we look at websites, for example, there's a website that Melanie alluded to, We Are Donor Conceived, and they send out a survey every year. And in 2018, they asked children who knew they were donor conceived, how did you find out? And about 3/4 found out from a parent or as a teen or as an adult, from another relative, but a full 26% 2 years ago found out from a DNA test. So can you imagine, you didn't know you were donor conceived, you sent your saliva to one of these companies for $100, and you realize that not only can did you find your relatives, but your relatives aren't who you think they are. This survey was repeated in 2019, and by 2019, this 26% went to 37%. So already over a third of donor-conceived children, at least on this website, in this group, found out that they were donor-conceived from a direct-to-consumer test. And so I think we've answered the question of, does donor anonymity exist? There's articles about the end of donor anonymity, and the things we can do we've already alluded to, but recipients may be able to find a donor by genetic testing of their children. So let's say I used a donor egg to conceive. I could even take the saliva of my baby and send it, there's a whole conversation about whether minors should even have DNA testing without their consent, but I could find out who the donor was, who the donor's children might be. The donors themselves may be able to find children conceived from their gametes, and not necessarily if the children provided DNA material, maybe if any relative of the child from the intended parent that did provide their genetic material. Offspring similarly may, first of all, be able to find out that they're donor conceived, and this is really earth-shattering, I think, because in the past, the only ways you might have found out are, you were told by a relative, maybe your blood type didn't match what you knew your parents' blood type to be, but there were very few ways to find out, and that has completely changed. Offspring may be able to find their gamete donors, the children of their gamete donors, their half-siblings, and any of their donors' relatives, the donor mother, grandmother, third cousin, who may not have known that the donor had made a donation of his or her gametes. So should donor anonymity exist is really the next question. I think we've decided that it does not exist. But then the question is, well, if it doesn't exist, is it a good thing or a bad thing? And if we go back to these surveys of donor-conceived individuals, the vast majority think it's wrong for parents to avoid disclosing the child's method of conception. And in fact, 78% don't support anonymous egg or sperm donation. And about half of those say, well, if you use an egg or sperm donor, at least you should know who that gamete donor is. And then the vast majority believe that donor-conceived people should not only find out that they're donor-conceived, but should learn the identity of their donor. So this goes, I think, a step beyond just knowing that you're donor-conceived. These kids want information. And so there have been a lot of cases of donor-conceived children demanding rights, looking for their relatives. There are articles about experiences of offspring searching for and contacting their donor siblings, but not always. In this article in the New York Times, a woman writes about her search to find her sperm donor, and she knew some information about him, and she knew the number from the sperm bank, and she tried to reach out to him, and she talks about how devastating it was to her and what it did to her self-esteem and her identity and her sense of self to not be able to find this person, and in fact to have this person reject her in the sense that he did not want to, he intentionally did not accept her letters and did not want contact. And then there's some contrarian views in terms of kind of the rights of the children and what's best for them. And in this article, it compares families in which children were told versus not told of their genetic origins. And I find this kind of an interesting study. It concluded that there's no difference in child well-being or parent-child relationships between kids that knew they were donor-conceived and kids that weren't. But it's really almost an impossible study to undertake, because how can you really do this study in an accurate way? Can you tell kids, oh, you're donor conceived, and by the way, are you glad I told you, or would you rather I didn't disclose this information? So it's really an impossible question, and it completely doesn't take into account the impact of unintended disclosure. So maybe kids would have been just fine if they never found out, but we can no longer assume this, similar to adopted children, but you cannot suppose that this disclosure will never happen, and a disclosure that happens to a child might be different from an older child to an adult, and so on. And so these are things that intended parents need to think about, I would argue, well before they enter into a donor egg or sperm relationship. And interestingly, this article argues that counselors and psychologists are actually biased in thinking that disclosure is optimal, and it may not be. But I think that is a little nearsighted, and that it doesn't at all take into account this incidental disclosure and all the other questions, and of course the rights of the child to know his or her identity and the circumstances of their conception. So I bring up this study. This is from 2005 in the UK, and it's an old study, but I want to contrast it with what's going on currently. And so the question is, if anonymity doesn't exist, maybe it should exist, because if it doesn't exist, we may run out of donors. That really hasn't been the case. We know that anonymity is hard to come by these days, and there's no shortage of men and women who are interested in donating their gametes. But in the study from 15 years ago, a third of donors said they wouldn't have donated if anonymity were removed, and half of recipients would not have sought out a donor. And imagine these 50% of people had children, and these children are already existing in their families, and these recipients that never had an intention to disclose, and in fact may not have entered into these relationships, now are faced with a decision that they had never anticipated. They thought about, they thought they wouldn't have to make it, and now they have no choice. And I just mentioned that this is a study that was done long before direct-to-consumer DNA testing became available. And so we wanted to look at this kind of in the more recently, and so we sent out a survey to sperm donors, and we were able to identify 118 donors. And interestingly, 40% had sent in a direct-to-consumer DNA test. That's much higher than the population, in general, that sends a direct-to-consumer DNA test. They've freely sent in saliva samples and shared their DNA kind of for the world to see. And I think that the donor population is probably a different population than the general population. They might be more willing to share if you're willing to share your gametes, you might be willing to share your DNA and your genetic identity. But in any case, we said, okay, so now that you've sent these DNA tests, are you worried that somebody will find you? And 68% said, not so much. And then when asked if these reports of finding biological parents using direct-to-consumer DNA tests would make them less likely to donate sperm, 81% said, no, we aren't. And then if we ask this a slightly different way, if your anonymity could not be assured, would this change the likelihood that you would donate sperm in the future? And the vast majority said it would not. Some said it would be less likely, but only 9%, less than 10% said that they would be unwilling to provide sperm, knowing that their identity could be discovered through direct-to-consumer DNA or in any way. And so I don't think that this is going to have a big impact on the pool of donors. I think it kind of makes us all more honest in terms of the circumstances of the conception. And so then really we have to think about promises that are broken, and what are these promises, and who did we make these promises to, and should we have broken them? Well, historically, many donors assumed they would be anonymous, and rightly so. There's no way to break anonymity. They were told they'd be anonymous. The recipients expected anonymity, and the offspring were completely not considered in this equation. And these arrangements generally were sustainable because the donors wanted to do something good and kind of move on. They didn't see themselves as the parents of these kids. The recipients forever appreciated the donation, but didn't want any long-term involvement with the gamete donors. And there was widespread acceptance of this practice. And the ability to identify genetic identity was really science fiction up until, a decade ago. We're really living in this what not too long ago seemed to be a futuristic society. And so the question is, who are the promises made to, and should we have broken them? And here there's a story of a woman who tried to find her sperm donor, had the contact information, and when she was 13, she reached out, and the sperm donor said, please don't contact me. And 5 years later, the wife of the sperm donor contacted this individual and said, well, I'm sorry, he was very young when he donated sperm. I feel very badly for you that you don't have this information. My kids actually kind of look like you, and maybe when they're a little bit older and we tell them about what, a dad's donation, we can meet. But I think that the recipient, the donor-conceived child, was very astute, and she said, our desire to know our lineage, our history, and where we come from should come before the desire of our biological fathers to remain anonymous. So who trumps? You can't know and not know. You either disclose because the child wants to know, or don't disclose because the gamete donor didn't want, or the intended parents, but you can't have it both ways. But that's not to say that this is always a bad thing, and there are lots of happy stories. In this situation, a donor-conceived child and her mother decided to seek out the egg donor, and they found her. And on the right, you can see in green the egg donor. She's very happy to be involved in the family, went to her donor-conceived child's graduation, introduced her to her children, and kind of live happily ever after. But you don't know how things are going to pan out. You don't know if the donors are going to want to be found, the children are going to want to find the donors. And so this is really a a Pandora's box of possibilities. And so what are these promises that are broken? Donors were promised anonymity. They may not have donated if this wasn't guaranteed, and we broke the promises after the fact. Such guarantees were more plausible in the past. Women and men who never intended on disclosing their identity are essentially being found by their genetic offspring and forced to disclose, sometimes decades after they donated. Imagine you're a grandmother now or a grandfather, and you get contacted by someone you didn't know this child existed in the world, and now there's a lot of explaining to do. Intended parents were promised anonymity. Parents may not have entered into relationships where they had donor-conceived children if they knew that anonymity would not be guaranteed. And then the donor offspring, nobody asked them if they wish their circumstances of their creation to be anonymous. And I think that they have a right to know their genetic origins. Hard-pressed to argue against that. And then my final slide, just, the question really here is balancing rights. On the one hand, you have the donor-conceived children, many of whom may not know they're donor-conceived, but they'll probably find out in the, new world that we live in. Many will want to know more information. And on the other hand, you have the donors and the parents who may have donated and become parents in an age when anonymity was guaranteed, and now the whole world has changed. And so how do you balance the rights of both of those towards and against anonymity? I would argue that if you're going to tip the balance, it should tip in the direction of the donor-conceived children, but I open it up to questions, and I look forward to the interactive part of the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Klipstein and the other panelists. We will now open up the floor to questions. Ms. Crocken will be moderating the session.
All right. Well, thank you to all three of you for a very fascinating series of perspectives on this important question and issues. I'm going to try to take these questions in the order I see them. And the first one, I think, goes to Melanie, which is, in the state of Washington, are donors allowed to change their consent decisions? In California, they may reconsider a no, but not a yes.
Great question. I may defer some of this to Susan and her legal advice as well. My understanding, the way that in our Uniform Parentage Act that it's written is that, yes, they do have the right to change their mind at any time, as long as they come back in, fill out the paperwork, and change whatever they originally had signed. Is that your understanding, Susan?
Yes and no. I think it's like California. You cannot change from a disclosed open identity to a non-disclosed, because the idea is that people have relied on that in accepting you as a disclosure donor or as an open donor. So I think it's like California was my understanding. It's a one-way change of mind from closed to open, but not open to closed. Melanie, is that okay?
That was not my understanding, just based on the Washington. And one of the things that UPA also says too, that in the future when we reach out to donors, we have to, again, if we can find them and they've said yes, we reach out to them. But my understanding was, and I would have to read it again, was that, they are still given that option, because it talks about if they didn't withdraw consent.
Yeah. Unless Washington changed that, because I was on the UPA committee, I think the UPA draft at least is only one direction, because otherwise you'd have a lot of families who had made decisions based on that and couldn't change them.
Agreed.
The next question,
yeah.
I'm not sure. Yeah. I'm not sure I think this is for Emily. It says, for banks that charge more for open ID donors, is the donor paid more?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I bet don't you, Melanie?
From the random, internet search, yes. So if I'm understanding the question correctly, some of the banks, the sperm banks, it does cost extra for vials of donors that say they would be, whether open ID or identity release or whatever terminology the bank is using. But I saw at least two that was the case.
And do you know, Melanie, I think the question was also asking, is the donor paid more for being an open donor when they're charged, when the recipients are charged more?
I actually do not know the answer to that question. I know in egg donation, it's definitely not the case in egg donation.
Okay. Yeah. And whoever would like to take this, someone asked if you could explain the difference between an ID donor, a non-ID donor, an anonymous donor, etc.
I think maybe, Melanie, since you brought it up, I think, the terminology is a little bit difficult because every bank has their own kind of definition of the terminology, and so you have to kind of read between the lines and ask a lot of questions. I don't think that there's any uniformity to what these terms mean. There's no standard for them.
Sorry, I was just going to say real quick, I think right now, too, it's such a transition time. Everyone is in the middle of changing their terminology because of this topic. So, we're hearing people kind of gradually move away from anonymous, but figure out what is the right term to use. So I think as a field, it'll be interesting to see if we start to standardize it. I know in the ASRM updated gamete donation guidelines that just went out for review to the membership this week, they were using, I think it was non-directed as a term of choice. So it'll be interesting to see how the banks and clinics and agencies all adapt to this.
Yeah. I think we could probably all four of us say that the term anonymous is no longer something any of us should be comfortable using, at least unless you put it in quotes, since it doesn't mean what we used to think it means. I think that's a takeaway from all three of your presentations. Someone asked what resources are there for intended parents about genetic grief and talking to their offspring. Are there books, groups, or associations that anyone could recommend? Melanie, that may go to you first, I think.
As far as genetic grief or just grief in general, I think that there's all types of resources for loss of the genetic connection, the grief that people would experience. I would always refer people, there's a lot of great resources. I know, like for egg donation, there's Parents Via Egg Donation. They have a lot of good resources, forums. The mental health professional group, we have a wonderful bibliography of different books and resources. That's another place to find. Resolve, the National Infertility Association, also has great resources. But I think it's, whether it's genetic grief, loss of the genetic connection, can also be melded together with grief just surrounding infertility and going through treatment. And even if it's not even if it's not donor related, there's still a lot of grief and processing.
The Donor Conception Network in the UK also has some great resources. And there's a genetic counselor actually who specializes in discussing these results and these DNA surprises with people, Brianne Kirkpatrick. Her company is called Watershed DNA. And she has some blog posts that are written toward parents of donor-conceived children who are now kind of seeing this coming and deciding just now to disclose for the first time to their children that they're donor-conceived, and some recommendations around that. So I'd encourage people to check out her website.
Is there any indication the DNA testing company databanks are going to be merging? And related question, can a testing site determine the age of the child whose sample is sent in? For example, we know of cases where parents send in a child sample to attempt to find out, in an attempt to obtain information that's not recommended, such as BRCA testing, and they lied about the age of a child.
So for the first question, no, I think the companies probably have every reason not to merge. But if anyone else has more knowledge on that, I'd be interested to know. One thing that's interesting is that, because of course you can only connect to people who are in the same, have tested at the same company that you've tested at, but I understand now there are apps being developed where you can sort of course you can always download your own raw data, but now you're able to kind of somehow cross through this app into the other databases and, search more widely that way without paying another company to start your sample over. So I think that's interesting. The second question, no, there's no way to tell age. So your DNA, mostly does not change as you age, so there would be no way to tell age. Most of these companies, from my understanding, do allow samples to be submitted on children, at least for the ancestry and relationship testing, as long as there is consent, that the legal guardian of the child is signing off on consent. The BRCA question, that's a whole nother topic, is just direct-to-consumer testing for health in general, which we should do a webinar on. Just speaking to ancestry and relationship testing, it is generally allowed for children with parental consent.
And I think it's important to also note that there's no oversight of these direct-to-consumer DNA tests, because you can send any sample, not necessarily yours or your child's, any where you can get a bit of saliva, right? And so there's no real oversight, and you get this information, and it's really just an open question of how much information you can get and how much verification. They're really not obligated to verify the sample or its identity.
Okay.
Yeah, we've all heard the stories of people sending in their pets' DNA and things like that.
How can we as counselors at clinics encourage young donors to carefully consider how they will feel in the future? Do you have any questions you ask to prompt reflection?
Again, I think the major component is A, that they're actually coming in for any kind of evaluation or psychoeducation, which that can be, again, it can be very different depending on different banks, depending on clinics, depending on who's requiring what. And as a whole, sperm donors don't tend to receive as much education or, quote, evaluation as an egg donor would. So again, I usually start off by the education, the talking about their thoughts and feelings, how would they feel if they were, contacted, even if they didn't sign a release to be contacted in the future. And then I honestly do talk about privacy versus anonymity, and that if they're not comfortable with the fact that someone could come knocking on their door 18 plus years from now, that probably being a donor is not the best thing for them, because being a donor isn't for everyone. So again, education, and that can really help in their decision making.
Somebody asked whether there is any implications for international donation in terms of the genetic testing, and does it change if they don't specify, but I assume it's going in either direction. Emily, do you know about?
I guess to what, Emily, go ahead, but.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just suppose if a family really wants to increase the chance that they might have a greater anonymity, I suppose you could look abroad for a donor, because it might be harder to trace per se. But I think the world's becoming a much smaller place, and so I'm not sure that anonymity really is going to be different depending on the site of the acquisition of the genetic material. I think that's maybe the question.
I think so. And one question was, is there likely to be a registry in the United States in the near future?
Who knows? I mean, do you guys want to talk about donor sibling registry? That there's sort of patient-driven and donor-driven registries, but there's not a national registry, and not any sort of concrete plans to develop one, although there's a lot of voices asking for one. So we'll see what the future brings.
Yes. Someone made a comment, we need to be sensitive to ethnic and cultural sensitivities on the question of disclosure and non-disclosure. Seems like the research in North America and Europe is based on an ethnocentric view. I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that or not.
I think that's always true. I mean, I would agree with that.
Yeah. There was a question about what I think this was for you, Sigal. What did you mean by genetic origins?
I meant who the gamete donor was, the sperm or the egg donor. Just that there's the question of whether you have a right to understand, where you came from a genetic perspective.
Okay. This may need to be our last question, and I'll throw this out to anybody. How would a clinic transition from anonymous donors to known donors? How much information is given to both donor and recipients? We've always recommended the donor sibling registry, but few patients take advantage of that due to cost. So I think the basic question I see is, how do you transition from anonymous to known if what everybody has said this evening, I think, is the world is now known, not anonymous? How do we make that reality match up with expectations of our patients and clients?
I do think that we're going to have to take a more active role and be more active participants in coming up with better policies, better procedures. I know that donor-conceived individuals They have been very active in organizing in groups, and I think that that's needed more of their input, hearing more from donor-conceived individuals. But I do agree that we're in a major transition time, and it's going to occur with or without us. So it really behooves us all to come up with better processes and procedures, record keeping, data management. That's going to be way more important. And even mental health professionals that really specialize in this after the fact, the 5 years, the 10 years, the 15 years down the road for all parties involved.
Yeah, I think the really interesting question here is, what do you do with those people that were promised anonymity and now it doesn't exist? It's much easier for a donor or an intended parent that comes in now because we know what the reality is now. But the ones that donated or received before we had direct consumer DNA did so under a very different presumption. So that's harder. I think moving forward, people read the papers, people understand that DNA is available and everybody can find everyone. So I don't think moving forward it's so much of an issue, but it certainly is an issue for those parents that did not intend maybe to disclose or didn't intend to disclose as early as they now are being perhaps forced to, and making very different decisions than the ones that most people go to counseling and kind of have considered everything, and then their whole world has changed with the DNA testing, and so now there's a whole new set of considerations. So I think this is an easier question moving forward than looking back.
Thank you, everyone. I think our time is more than up. I'm sorry for the questions we didn't get to. There's lots of them. I think the slides will be made available, which will answer some of those that I tried to skip through. And I think that closes us for the evening. Thank you, everyone, and thank you, ASRM, for holding the webinar.
Thank you, Ms. Crocken. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our attendees for joining us today. You will receive a survey by email after this session. Your feedback helps us give you the most relevant content. Your input is appreciated. This session was recorded and will be available on our website in the near future. Please watch your email for notification about future webinars. For any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us at webinars@asrm.org. This concludes the webinar.